Now, let's hear it for Joe.
He said that he was going to introduce absolutely nobody. Didn't he? My name's Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. And I'm very near ashamed to admit this, but I'm a Methodist and a Mason. And if I serve any purpose at all up here tonight, I guess it would be to prove that Protestants can get well, too. I'm always amazed when I stand up in front of a group of people like you. I have the privilege of looking into, what was it, 8,020 white eyeballs. And I'm forced to say that I wonder what in the hell ever happened to the stigma on alcoholism. As I look at this group of folks here, my friend John Wesley commented on it last night about the way they're dressing nowadays. These bright things that we take the license to wear, and particularly the men. It works a terrific hardship on the women, I'm sure, because you can't tell who the pimps are anymore. See, one fellow didn't laugh. I've been a guest of this convention before once, and its rules are still the same. The chairman here is a very hard, disciplined man to live with. He takes you into his room and recites all the rules of the convention, and harps upon a lot of things that you must and must not do at this convention. And one of them is to absolutely use no profanity whatsoever. And John Wesley shot that out of the saddle in 10 minutes last night. And then the two priests came along and turned the air blue with it. And he got me again this evening, and he said, "Do you think you can abide by this rule of no profanity?" And I said, "You can bet your ass I can." I don't really know how to get started. I got to wander around here a little and get close to the public. But he also didn't take any more chances, and he's had me cloistered in a suite up here with the great spiritual leaders from Laguna Beach. And I've been running and putting my ear to the keyhole all the time I've been here to see if I could pick up some spiritual tidbit of great note. And all I can hear is the John flushing. I faintly heard one morning saying, "Honey, come down off of the ceiling, breakfast is nearly ready." Well, I am happy to be here. I'm happy to be anywhere sober and alive, because this society is even beyond my description I do not have the words to describe it. But of all the things that I think that we get from our sobriety that we should cherish more than any would be the ability to laugh at ourselves. This is the greatest gift, because I think that most of us in the state of desperation when we entered the doors were not in any fit condition to laugh again. 6 or 7 years ago, I met Bill in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we had gone down there to straighten out the doctors in AA, and I remember he came in and talked on Sunday morning, and he got up, and I got to give this little thing to these two priests who are with us, because we owe so much to this. So many of the people who lit candles to this society. And I heard the name mentioned last night, Sister Ignatia, and this is one of the tenderest spots in my heart, because she was a crusty little sister who immediately fell in love with one of our co-founders and treated some, I suppose 5,000 alcoholics, and did it until the day she died. But during the course of her treating alcoholics, she got to where she could talk like us and learn some of the vernacular of the alcoholic. And this is, the story goes, there was a drunk one night that Sister Ignatia, can't hear me, that Sister Ignatia was working with, and he was come in, and he was going through this state of, what do you call that stuff, detoxifying? They use that nowadays. We used to call it puking. But he was filled with self-pity. And he cried out to Sister Ignatia, and he said, "Sister, will you pray for me?" And she said, "Hell no, pray for yourself, because God loves to hear strange voices." And I think that some of us, in our desperation, cry out in strange voices. And Bill got up this Sunday morning, and he said, "I've just come from the Sister Ignatia's funeral." And he said, "You know, instead of it being a day of sorrow, it was a day of rejoicing. A day of pure joy that God had been kind to give us one like this courageous soul." And I sat there and thought that here we are, the most fortunate minority of people in existence, who ultimately learn to laugh at ourselves. And this, I'm eternally grateful. Now, I don't know, in fact, I'm bordering on illiteracy compared to some of the intellectuals that you've already had up here. And I don't know really a whole lot about alcoholism statistically. I can tell you what an alcoholic is not. Very recently, I was flying out to Las Vegas to hold services. And there was a fellow got on the plane and conducted himself in a most abominable manner, most disgusting. Let me tell you what he did. You know, when he sat down, he was an impeccably dressed gentleman. And when the stewardess started hustling the booze, he ordered one of these big, delightful, icy-looking things, you know about. And then he did a thing that was most revolting. He set that drink on a tray and began to read. And he damn near drove me crazy. I just drew up more to say, "Drink it, man, drink it, please, drink And do you know, when the stewardess carried the thing away, there was still some of it left in the glass. Now, the difference is this. The stewardess said to me, "Mr. Leith, would you like to have a drink?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I got to be home in February." She said, "I don't understand." I said, "You never will." But this is the case of we who were compulsed, or I don't like that word, we were who were obsessed to drink. Who were obsessed to drink. This is a strange phenomenon that occurs among us. It bothers some of us excessively. And we wonder and worry why this sad thing has happened to me, the charming fellow that I am. And even after we come to AA, we wonder why we drank. I've seen people work at that one 15 years and then die, wanting to know why they drank. We've got a book in Alcoholics Anonymous under title Alcoholics Anonymous. And on the cover of it, it says it's a text for Alcoholics Anonymous. It's going to catch on one of these days and get a few of you to read it. But in the very front of it, when the little doctor made three of the greatest statements, I guess, ever, and I'm going to read them to you, it reads like this: men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. And you know, them damn psychiatrists just very near had me convinced that I drank because my mama put me on the pot backwards. Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. The next sentence goes, it says that sensation is so elusive that even though they admit that it is injurious, after a time they cannot differentiate the true from the false. After a time, it's kind of like in the scripture, it says, "And it came to pass." After a time, they cannot differentiate the truth from the false. And the third sentence is very dangerous. It says, "He thinks." That's killed a lot of them. Says, "He thinks." Now, watch this. Says he thinks that his alcoholic life is the only normal one. And if you intend to go reading one of these psychological pamphlets over the side of the bed, you better do it quick and run or you'll puke on you, I'll tell you. Because as he lays there and dies, he thinks that his alcoholic life is the only normal one. And the only barrier, the only thing that will break the barrier is the thing that every speaker has gotten up here today and talked about yesterday. This is the medium of understanding. The only thing. So, them damn policemen again. We're going to have to lead better lives than that. So, for the fellows that held up their hand yesterday, they're the ones that predominantly I'd love to visit with for a few minutes, the ones making their first conference. I don't know a great deal about it, but I love to talk about how an alcoholic feels. How does an alcoholic feel? I came to AA as a result of the way I felt. I didn't come here we spend a hell of a lot of time trying to make a dainty disease out of alcoholism, The more we tell it, the sweeter it gets, and you'd think that somebody was going to play Debussy's Dance of the Fawn when they come in the door, My alcoholism was not that way. And enough to tell you a little about how I felt. And some of the things that happened to me along the line. Did you ever have the roof of your mouth sunburned? That cat has. You got to lay in the right position for that. Have you ever woke up with brown whimpers? Or have you ever learned to talk in shorthand? Have you ever been arrested while in jail? These are just a few of them. John Hopkins had 33 of those little innocuous questions that are way too old now. Got to have something like this to put your teeth in if you're going to live with the old drunk. But all of these things seemed to plague us, and we suffered along, and we never could find an answer to why it was happening to people like us. Why? This was the big question all the time. Why does it have to happen to me? Well, I've read our book, this book I referred to a while ago. Some of you may be familiar with it. And Bill came out of Towns Hospital, and in the construction of our book, he came out with a beautiful description for us, one of the easiest, most gentle terms that we could ever figure for our disease, and it was a cover-up for everything, and that was the word obsession. The word obsession. He could have used a lot of words that were more cruel than that, more effective than that. He could have said that we had a compulsion, or that we had an addiction, or what is the high one that said that we could have had an alcoholic syndrome, if you please. I used to think that a syndrome was a cat house where they competed. I didn't know. Such a gentle word. Such a gentle word. There was a cover-up for everything they ever did. And if you go to the dictionary and look up the word obsession, you'll find that it reads like this: to be possessed of an idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. To be owned by an idea to the exclusion of all other ideas. To will to do something and have no control over doing it. An obsession. This is what we have, and society actually condemned us for what the obsession made us do instead of for the obsession itself. And psychiatry wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They don't want to talk about obsession. But this was the cover-up word that Bill puts so gently in our book of experience in 3 or 4 places. Now, obsession, if you got one, you got one. I've had a lot of obsessions. I think sex is a kind of an obsession. If you work on it strong enough. I got a roving hand. But if he's got an obsession to get up and dance while I'm standing there talking, he'll do it in spite of hell. He'll do it under any condition. Maybe I can describe an obsession a little better than that in the vernacular that we talk about. When I was a kid, my father had an old dog, and he named him Millard Fillmore for some reason or other. And if he'd had 2 more left feet, we'd named him Reagan. But Millard was just an average dog, a kid's dog. We had him there at the house, and everybody loved Millard. And he had great big brown eyes. He was just a dog. And but Millard had the worst case fleas that you have ever seen in your life. The scratching was a way of life with him. And he scratched to remove his discomfort. When he became uncomfortable, he scratched. And we cursed him for what his scratching made him do. You know, you ever hear a dog thump at night, you know, like that. Keep you awake all night. My father tired of this, and he bought some of the most hellish-smelling soap that you ever can imagine, and after a couple of rounds of close-in fighting, we got Millard in a tub, and we bathed him and defleed him. And we got every flea off of him. And he still wanted to scratch. You see, the necessity to remove his discomfort had become an obsession. And he'd look up at me with those old brown eyes, you know, and want to scratch, and I wouldn't let him scratch. And then he became very furtive about it, and I'd see him running off and sneaking a scratch. And we cursed him for what his obsession made him do, not for the obsession itself. And society cursed us. Until somebody tried to sit down and understand why we scratched. You know? Until the advent of our society, when somebody found a way, found the greatest descriptive thing on earth for we who had the obsession. We found a solution to our problem. Found a solution to our problem. But these things can go on endlessly, and I guess it's necessary to tell a little about my drinking. It was rather untidy. And in the later days, I ended up drinking this delightful thing you have here in California, and that's wine. And somebody called me Wino once, in fact. And I don't think we should criticize wine too much. It's a great thing. It has a lot of medicinal purposes, and wine will cure hay fever. If you drink it like I did, you don't dare sneeze. You talk about being born to the purple, look down. But I started drinking when I was 17 years old, innocently enough. Innocently enough with a group of young fellas in my group, 6 or 7 of them, and some of them are in my hometown presently, and I know them real well. And they still remain in the realm of social drinkers, whatever the hell that place is. And they just didn't do the same thing to them that it did to me. Now, I have a very humble opinion about social drinking, and you can take it or leave it. And that is that if you take the most pious and unctuous old sister out of the church, and slap about 8 slugs of that gallow in her that I used to drink, she's going to become unsocial as hell. Ain't nothing social about 8 drinks of gallow. But I used it. It did the things for me that were necessary, and I began to use it. Don't think it was compulsive, and really don't know whether I was obsessed. It doesn't make a lot of difference. But I knew that a few drinks of this delightful stuff changed my personality. And it did for me what I couldn't do for myself. I became adequate, and I became witty, and I became brilliant, and if you needed to go up, you go up. If you need to come down, you come down. Whatever you needed. And this is a story of the beginning of an alcoholic. I ended up in Southern California, and over in a place called Hollywood over there, wherever that is. And for an East Texas country boy, I picked one of the weirdest professions I guess you could get into, and that was designing ladies' lingerie. And this is where you cut these soft silk, sleazy, intimate things that the ladies wear. And I think it was here that maybe I crossed from the social to the pathological drink. I don't know where, but we have a step in Alcoholics Anonymous, the second one that infers that you might have a gopher in the garden. And now, if you cut a bunch of braziers with 3 of them places in them, you're nuts. And I told a psychiatrist about that, and he said it was just wishful thinking. I worked for a kindly Jewish fellow who couldn't understand why the alcoholic does what he does. I drank with him on parties, but alcohol treated him differently from what it treated me. And he came to me one day and he said, look, I've got lots invested in you, but you got to go. You got to go. He said, you can't drink. And then he, in an aside, he said, I'm thankful for one thing, though, and that is that you weren't a rabbi, or you would have destroyed our whole race the way you use them scissors. You got to let that roll around for a little while. I remember losing my first job as a result of being what I am. And he shoved me out of there. I cut myself out of that profession entirely. And I remember how I felt about it, because I was an enthusiastic young fellow who didn't have the answer to the question. The war was going on, and I went down to a place called San Pedro, and I bought a plumber's license out the back door of a union hall down there, and went into the shipyard as a master plumber. And you can well know that I was a master fraud. And those were the days, if you want to date yourself, when you were, and this is revolting as hell to even think of, when you were frozen to your job. And I thawed out. I have a piece of a document now that hangs in my den with a lot of other trophies. And it's a yellow document, and it's signed by the United States Department of War Labor. And it prohibits me from working within 25 miles of the city of Los Angeles. Then you move. Have you ever heard heard the tearful plea when the guy says to his wife, honey, let's go somewhere else and start over, start over, start over. The only thing wrong with the theory of moving an alcoholic from one place to another is that when you get there, he's there too. And we moved up into Sacramento, and the things that I could choose to do were becoming less all the time. And I went to work for the railroad, and I'd love to say here they're the most narrow-minded group of people that I've ever come in contact with, really. They have a rule about drinking, and they say that if you're seen coming out of an establishment that dispenses alcoholic beverages, you can be discharged. And I never came out very often. If I did, then it was under duress and coercion, and I guess they were justified in having this rule. You run more than one train on a track, and they feel, I guess, that if a man's a little bit addled, that he's liable to mix them up. It's a damn good thing you don't have to guide one of those, And this is just exactly what I did. They had the audacity, the unmitigated effrontery to hang a bulletin. The railroads use bulletins a great deal, and they want you to know something. They hang a big bulletin out here, and they said that they had a system up at the top of the Sierra Nevada mountains where we cut our helper engines out that was perfect, electronically perfect. And they further added, some fellow got carried away with himself. He said, it is physically impossible to make a mistake up there. And I don't know of any self-respecting drunk that wouldn't have had a whack at that one. Physically impossible to make a mistake up there. Well, that takes working on, and by some quirk of alcoholic circumstance, I got two engines going towards one another with 4 cars between them, carrots, apples, lettuce, and celery, and made the biggest fruit salad in the history of California. And they wanted to fire me. And I had another alcoholic representing me at the investigation, and they only gave me 60 days. But I remember the old superintendent when he came out of the investigation. He was a kindly old gentleman, and he, too, couldn't understand why we do the things that we do. Why we do the things that we do. And he told me, he was real bitter about it. He said, you should be arrested for even walking on our right-of-way, and I'm going to get you if it's the last thing I ever do. And they ultimately did. There's a common plea, we hear it here in AA, and our fellows that come into Alcoholics Anonymous, who have one complaint. We all have that in common. I've heard every drunk that's ever come in there always complain about his inability to hide a jug. It seemed to me that the old the Al-Anon always ferreted it out, and poured it down the sewer. And this is a horrible thing in the life of an alcoholic. We couldn't hide a jug. One night, one night I got called, maybe you'll understand the parlance of the railroad, I got called to go out on an extra train from a little place called Roseville up to a town called Marysville. And we were going to do some work during a fruit season, and I gathered to my crew a group of fellows like me. And we went up there under very strenuous circumstances. Again, it's nice that you don't have to guide them. And did a little work, actually, by brute force and awkwardness. But about 10 o'clock in the evening, I discovered to my delight a shed of some sort. It was a big packing shed, and it had a track running in it. And I took my train, and I started chopping it up into little pieces all over town so that it would have no resemblance of being a train. And then I put the engine and the caboose in this shed, and we locked the door and retired to the bar. And the war was going on at that time, and the dispatcher became concerned. He hadn't heard from us in hours, and you're supposed to run over some little electronic gadgets that beep in his ear, and he didn't get any beeps, and he called up and down the railroad looking for us to no avail. And finally he sent an official from the company up to Marysville to look for us, and he found us in this combination bar and pool room at 2 o'clock in the morning. And these are the pathetic words that he said to me. "What did you do with it?" Do you know that I couldn't hide a jug from that one? It was physically impossible. Got a nose on her like. I hear these guys get up there and say, "I wonder how I lived so long to get here." I wonder how some of these Al-Anons lived that long, the way they harassed us and treated us, you know. One of her little fetishes was, you know, on Sunday morning when you'd be lying in delicately and wake up with every chromosome in your, whatever a chromosome is, in your body tearing apart, and they'd crank up this damn vacuum sweeper and hit every leg of the bed. And we talk in AA about our suffering and how we rise above it. You know, it's pitiful the way they treated us. Ramona dwelt upon that this morning for a little while. And you have to pay off?
Yeah.
He thinks that his alcoholic life is the only normal one. He thinks that his alcoholic life is the only normal. I thought it was normal. You know, to throw up every morning. I did, you know, it's just that way. I thought everybody threw up every morning. I used to rent a hotel room with twin beds in, one to sleep in, one to puke in. It's just that simple, there's no question. He cannot differentiate the truth from the false, and he's completely oblivious to things that go on around him. You're talking to him right over his head. He doesn't know how he feels. The alcoholic doesn't. I'll tell you a little story. I've been asked to repeat this, and I really shouldn't. But to show you that an alcoholic absolutely has no regard for his immediate surroundings, I'll tell you a little story that happened to me one time many years ago. I was living in a little town called Goose Creek, Texas, and my wife had gone up into Illinois to help her sister have a baby, and while she was gone, I got fired. And the routine in those days was to return home to Mama. I don't know whether you folks ever did that or not, but I always barged out from Mama's no matter what happened to me. And my wife had 2 tomcats. We've always had cats. Some good ones and bad ones, but we've had cats all along. And I knew that if I didn't come home with these cats, I couldn't get in. So I loaded the car with a few belongings that we had, and I put the 2 tomcats in the back seat. And I started for Tyler, which was some 300 miles away. And as I got to the outskirts of Houston, I saw a beautiful sign that read 3 pints for the price of 2. And never being one to pass up a bargain, I bought the 3 pints for the price of 2 and set out. If I remember, it was a cool, pleasant evening. The windows were frosted up, and God was in his heaven, and everything was just all right. And I'd take a belt and drive and talk to myself and sing a little "Oh, Promise Me." You never have done that. And I got to a little town up there called Cleveland, Texas, and I had to get out to get a chaser for one of these jugs. And when I came back to the car, one of the damn cats got out. And by this time, I was beginning to stumble a little, and I chased him all over this little town. It was raining gently then, in the mud, and I finally caught him. I treed him up under a cotton gin, and I took him by one of his hind legs, and I whipped him all the way back to the car. And I threw him in the back of this hot automobile, and he did a thing in that back seat that wasn't nice. It was sort of a Picasso study in brown. Do you think it bothered me? I crawled right in, took off down the road, took another honk on the jug, talked to myself some more, and sang a little "Oh, Promise Me." Perfectly oblivious to my surroundings. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, I threw up in the front seat. Never bothered me. Kept right on a-going, singing and a-talking to myself. And at daybreak, I pulled into a little town called Alto, Texas, and it had one long main street and dim street lights, and it was just breaking day, and I pulled over to the side to take a honk on one of the jugs. Oh, God, it's sickening to even think of it. And there was a town clown there, a constable or a sheriff of sorts, and I guess it was his first chance to make an arrest in many years. And he raced up to the side of the car and beat on the glass and said, "Let that glass down." I let the glass down, and he stuck his head in that window and said, "What do you think you're? Oh, my God." And he slowly walked away. Let me say to you that when you put your arm around the sick old drunk, he don't know how he feels. He really doesn't. With all the progress that we make, all the facilities that we have at hand, all of the intellectuality, I'd love to say to you that nothing will substitute for an hour of your time. And he thinks that his alcoholic existence is the only normal one. And I ended up in a hospital in San Francisco I was a down case. Hell, they didn't even know how to check me in down there. And in those days, there wasn't any facilities for the alcoholic. And they put me in the very justifiably so, in the nervous ward. And they ran me through one of the most stringent clinics on the West Coast. On top of my head, the bottom of my feet. A lot of fun with the shakes. I learned one great lesson, and that is don't go to a proctologist with a hangover. But the result of this trip through the clinic was that I had nothing organically wrong. Now, a hospital has to have some sort of an answer. They couldn't say he's just here for for the vacation or to rest up. They got to have an answer. That's one of their flaws, I guess. And this was my introduction to psychiatry. And I have a very humble observation about psychiatry, and that is that very few of us had our alcoholism beaten out of us through our knees. But they sent in this frustrated piano tuner, and he interrogated me and asked me a lot of foolish questions, and I gave him a lot of brilliant answers. If he's not an alcoholic now, it's not my fault. If you want to get into an enjoyable pastime, start feeding a psychiatrist symptoms. And I could lead him all the way down the track. Another way, the way I finally got loose from the fellow, if you want to get rid of a psychiatrist, I know none of you are going to need this, but you let two drunks lay up in bed one night and memorize the same dream to tell him the next day. He quivered. But he dumped me out of the hospital, and they turned me loose. You can get an immediate cure that way. And they put me on another delightful little dose that some of our girls in AA are quite fond of. And that's sodium bromide elixir. That's the granddaddy of Nervine. You've heard of Nervine, haven't you? We drink it in the South very much. It's real good. It's made from bromide. It's nice ride. Not with 2 or 3 things wrong with it. Your eyes will cross and you froth at the mouth. But you'll get on the program, but you won't, because you won't live but a few minutes at a time on bromide. You don't know what happened a while ago, and you don't much care what's going to happen after. Well, you've heard them say Aunt Minnie can't come out today because she's nervous. Sure she can't come out. She's stoned. But I'd gotten it, and then I'd learned another little trick in the hospital, and that was, pills are very popular, and they come by vogues. I think, what's popular today in the pill realm? Is it Valium? I believe that's the one they're hustling now. I was very young when I got on pills, and I had phenobarbital. And he prescribed these phenobarbital to relax me, and he gave me 5 shot glasses full of sodium bromide elixir, he said, to relax me. And with my thinking, I figured that if a few shots of that would relax me, a jug would be a hell of a lot better. And I bought it by the jug from an unsuspecting intern. And I relaxed. People used to caution me when I drank too much and say, straighten out and be a man. I did, just like that. Straightened out. But finally, one day they came and threw me out, and I went back to Sacramento. And had my cake, and I could eat it. I had a disease. I'd run the whole gamut from nervous anxiety to schizophrenia, ambulatory schizophrenia of all things. You know what an ambulatory schizophrenic is? That's a going Jesse with dual wheels. But I got double-crossed in Sacramento by a bartender. He called my wife one day, and he said, Mrs. Leith, you think your husband's sick. When you go to work in the morning, he comes down here. And when he runs home at 11:30, and you come home, feed him his meal over the side of the bed, and then when you leave again, he comes back down here and said, we don't want him. And when you've had it with those fellas, you've had it. This is the worst thing on earth to lose as a bartender. But they loaded me up and put me back in the hospital again, and I had another 3 weeks of treatment under another psychiatrist. This first one refused to come to see me. He was offended. And I stayed another 3 months under analysis. And finally one day, some feller come in there and put the britches on me. And he said, you got to get out of here and let some sick people come in. And they dumped me again. And he asked me, he said, where are your people? And I said, they're down in Texas. And I think his eyes lit up. And he said, go down there by all means. There's been a treatment for the alcoholic down through the centuries, up until the advent of our society, and that treatment has been keep him moving. Keep him moving. And no family likes to admit that they've got one of us, and my family sure as hell had one. Keep him moving. And I went down to my hometown in Texas. The genius returned home after these many years. And I met a little small-town psychiatrist down there, and he was a lonely little fella. And he loved to talk, and I'd go and sit and let him talk. And he'd give me pills with a popcorn sack full. I had my cake, and I could eat it. And my people had me locked up. My own mother had me locked up in the local jail. And I remember this particularly cutting and humiliating scene, how I hated and how I felt and how little I felt towards these people. My own mother having me locked up in this jail cell. And I remember these feelings that I had that I couldn't rid myself of, which were part of this uncontrollable obsession. One Monday morning, there came a fellow to my boudoir with the vertical Venetian blinds. And he introduced himself and called for me by name. And it was a real, if I look back on it honestly, I'd have to say that it's a real cruel scene. A real cruel scene. You know, prior to this time, if people had gotten close to me about my problem, I could spin on my heel and leave. But when you're in jail, you're a captive audience. And you could only spin so far, and I couldn't spin out of where I could hear from him. And he stood there and very peacefully gave me what we have come to know is the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we talk about it. We beat our gums a whole lot in AA about what is the message of Alcoholics Anonymous? What is it that we have that nobody else can have? What separates us from the man out on the street? And he said 5 magic words to me that nobody else until the advent of this time had been able to say. He said, I know how you feel. So I suppose this is the true message of our society, is one soul saying to another, I know how you feel. It kind of believed him. There was a communication there, and he proved the point that you have to assert nothing. To assert it is to lose it. And he stood there and calmly and peacefully as he could be, and he told me about himself. And he set a trap. If he'd have talked about me, I could have given him an answer for anything. only about him. And he used some words repetitively in there about we have found from our experience. And I heard them for the first time in my whole life. Did I hear anybody? Well, I didn't accept him. I didn't go with him. I was too filled with bitterness and hatred. And he went back and reported to my people, and they hired 2 deputy sheriffs to load me into a police car and carry me some 200 miles to Houston, Texas, and sit with me until the train went west. What did I say a while ago? Keep him moving. Keep him moving. And they unloaded me off of that train in Los Angeles, the old depot. Most of you are familiar with the scene, in a wheelchair. Some smart aleck said, you can't live in this car. We use it. It goes both directions. And I had kind of set up shop in one of the toilets, and they carted me out. With all the jocular remarks that I might make, all the levity that we have fun in looking back at the ridiculous antics of an alcoholic, I can honestly say to you, I went through the next 5 months of a living hell. And I drank as few people have and lived to tell the tale, I suppose. And I ended up in a flop house in Sacramento that had 18 beds in it. And one of the reasons that I'm so grateful to the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous for finding me is for the fact that I don't know what happened to those fellas in the other 17 beds. I don't have but one question to ask of this society, really. I think I know most everything there is to know about it. But there's still one question unanswered in my mind, and that was, how come I was the lucky one? How come I was the lucky one out of the other 17 guys to find not only a solution to a problem, but a way to stay alive? And I got up and crawled out of the flop house on account of a little piece of literature this man had given me, and went back to Texas to find AA. Rather dramatic story, isn't it? A drunk does everything dramatically, and after I got back to Tyler and got into AA, I discovered that there was an AA club 3 blocks from where I left in Sacramento. You think that ain't a dirty joke to pull on a drunk? 2,600 miles to do it. And I found this wonderful society of ours because the man came to see me unsolicited. And I sometimes grow weary sitting around these fat cat clubs and hearing some smart ass say if he wants it, let him come get it. He's the fellow that has not read chapter 7 in our book of experience, where in the second sentence it says unequivocally that with an exclamation mark, carry this message to the alcoholic. Exclamation mark. It says in the 7th chapter of our book of experience that the surest immunity against drinking is extensive work with other alcoholics. And that's what I came for, to be immune from drinking. And I came without shame. I think this is the most prideful place that anyone could want to be. It's where we are now. This is the most prideful of all things. And there is a line in our book of experience. It's one of the greatest promises of all time. And it reads like this. Cling to the thought that in God's hands your dark past is the greatest treasure you possess. And the very next sentence puts you in business with God right up to your hocks, I'll tell you. It says, with it, this dark past, you can avert death and misery for others. What other facet of society has been given a gift like that, the dark past. And I thought I was going to have to get rid of it when I came to AA. I thought these things that I had done as a result of the uncontrollable obsession would have to be locked up in a closet, as the book says. And I found that beautiful promise. Cling to the thought that in God's hands your dark past is the greatest treasure you possess. I'll tell you two little stories and I'll sit down. I got to AA and I went through all of the mistakes. It's been laughingly said that the reason that our society is here today, that when Bill and Bob got started, there weren't any old AA members there. But I learned it all in a week. I got so heavenly cured, and I quit cussing and just did I became godlike. Have you ever seen any AA members who are godlike? I got a call one night to go see a drunk, and all he wanted was somebody to haul him and retrieve his bottle. And I couldn't see this. I was so godlike. And I took another friend of mine and I in my new automobile, a result of AA, and I drove him down the street. And I began to give him the pitch. And I remember how good I felt. And as I drove slowly and talked eloquently, his eyes began to water. And I knew I had him. Oh, God, I felt good. And as we drove on down the street, he gently lay his head over on my shoulder. Did you ever hear anybody puking silently? Every time I've ever gotten godlike with a drunk, he pukes on me. You do it every time. And I don't know how long you stay with a guy in AA. I've seen some wonderful things happen in AA. I worked with one in my town for 4.5 years. He was scurvy, and he looked like I did when I went to see him the first time, and I borrowed a goblet of whiskey and poured it down him to get him to an AA meeting. And I got him, and when he kind of came unshuffled from this drink, he was in AA. I think any way you get him there is good. And he got sober, and he stayed sober for 3 months. And he got drunk. It didn't hurt him a hell of a lot, but it was a blow to my ego. And I knew that he had to sober up ultimately under the influence of my eloquence and piosity. And I went and got him again. He got sober, and he got drunk, and he got sober, and he got drunk. Now, this went on for 4.5 years. And I prayed about him. I thought, God, you've been watching them sparrows too much to let me have this one. And he had another little affectation that none of you have ever heard of. He'd go to faraway places and call me collect. Just to tell me that he was drunk. And I prayed about him some more. And about 12 years ago, he got on for him what I hope was his last drunk. And he called another fellow from our club who's not half as smart as I am. And he went out and talked to that bastard 10 minutes, and he's been sober ever since. And I hated his guts. And I'd sit in the club and look at him and think, you ought to be mine. And if I know anything of the treasures that God gives us in this society of ours, I owe him more than he owes me. He kept me sober for 4.5 years. That's my description of our program. I heard the first speaker here on Friday night talk about a little thing that's dear to us all. And I'm going to close with telling a little story that came out of a book. It'll only take a minute. And that is the story that comes out of the good book. The only difference between this story of the fellow going to see a sick fellow is that it was written 2,000 years ago. And it's the description of a guy they call a demoniac. I'm sure that those of you who are Bible students are very familiar with it. But this fellow was a nut. And I'll have to tell it like I read it. It was a pure nut. It said that the manifestation of his disease, believe you me, they said, disease, were such that they had to keep him in fetters and chains. And that no man could tame him. He was so wild, this demoniac. I guess they called him that for the lack of better verbiage. If he'd have been under analysis today, they'd have probably called him a catatonic or a bedwetter. But he was a demoniac, which meant a maniac full of demons. This is in the Scripture. And he got so bad, like me, that they ran him out of town. And he ended up out on the riverbank eating with pigs. And if your imagination is half as good as mine, you can see the scene. You can see him there, and the babble, the beard, the stench that goes along with it, the habiliments of a drunk, full of self-pity. And there seemed to have been, at that time, a little carpenter fellow who was going about the country teaching a new philosophy of love. And he had a little thing there that none of us in AA have quite acquired. He could see no ill in anyone. And he went up to this cat, and he said, "Say, fella, you are having some trouble." And I can see the fellow in his self-pity. He said, "Yes, trouble is my name. They call me Legion, which means many." And I can see him. And the little carpenter didn't wait a minute. He knew he needed some help, and he gave it. He administered it, and the treatment that he used was as little understood in those days as the treatment of Alcoholics Anonymous is today. And it had to do with casting some of these evil spirits out and putting them into some pigs. And the story goes, the pigs went off into the sea and were destroyed. And there were some stool pigeons around. And they ran into the city and told these people that owned the pigs, they said to them, "You're out of the pig business." And in those days, the pig business was big business. And these people that owned the pigs came in mass out to the riverbank to see what had happened to their big business. And these are the words that I love. I will repeat what Johnny said when he stood up here Friday night. When they got there he sat, fully clothed and in his right mind. We have a step in Alcoholics Anonymous that reads the second one, "Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity." There he sat, fully clothed and in his right mind. And these people were still incensed at that, and they were more interested in the loss of the material things than they were in the fact that one feller got well. Coming down. One feller got well. In AA, you better believe we better be interested in one feller getting well. And they prevailed upon him to leave, and I can see this fellow in the timidity of having come from one hellish existence into the beginning of another and not experiencing any joy. And he turned to what I would like to call his sponsor. And he said to the little carpenter, "Can I go with you?" And the little carpenter broke a rule for us. Prior to that time, he had always said to everybody that he'd ever helped, "Go on now and don't say anything about it. But he gave this sick guy an admonition that I would pass on to you in Alcoholics Anonymous. He said to him, stay here so that others can see what has happened to you. Thank you very much.